may or may not know that before this podcast, I hosted another one called STEM, Insider Tips for Greenhouse Pros. And although the technology was different, I was using an old school mic, recording on Skype, doing all sorts of file converting, the topics were important and the guests were top notch. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and every once in a while, I'll jump back in time and re-release a STEM episode. In this Tech on Demand podcast rewind, I'm joined by Darwin Perennials General Manager Karl Batschke, who took us through some of the new ways to better produce the latest and greatest perennial genetics. But he didn't talk about the easy ones. Instead, Karl addressed some of the more challenging crops and also newer crops that require different cultural and technical regimes. I called them the Perennial Problem Children. And like a good guidance counselor, Karl treated each one as an individual and created a custom plan to maximize their potential so you can achieve the results you want, your best crops ever. But since I had Karl on the hook for 40 minutes, I asked him plenty of questions about the market for perennials, what he was seeing and hearing in his travels pre-2020, and thoughts and predictions for the future, which, since this conversation is almost 6 years old, could be what we are experiencing today. Karl has tons of industry knowledge and experience, and I was really happy to have this chance to pick his brain for a bit. Karl, welcome to STEM.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's sure great to be here.
You started in a family greenhouse. You graduated from the Hort Powerhouse, Michigan State. You've had experience in the business side of the industry, products, breeding, domestic and offshore. You really have a range of industry knowledge over many years. So first off, can you tell us a little bit about your role with Darwin and perhaps one or two reasons you're excited about the current perennials market, and then we can talk about the future outlook a little bit later.
Sure. Well, thanks. My role with Darwin Perennials is I'm the Global Product Development Manager, which means that I'm in the great position of being able to work with growers both in the U.S. and Europe, looking at what their needs are in the perennial market, and then take that information back to our breeders in the U.S. and in Europe primarily, and try to connect the dots, really get the breeders to work on solutions for the growers, and then put those through an extensive trialing system and then bring them to market. In terms of what's exciting, I think, in the perennial world, with all this new product coming out, really is making lots of new opportunities, and the perennial market is growing. It's very actively growing. So to me, I think those two things coming together are pretty exciting.
Oh, and that I would agree. The perennial market is wide open right now from a demand perspective from consumers and growers. So I definitely think you guys are in a really good position in connecting the dots between the needs of growers and what the breeders are working on is certainly a key piece of the puzzle. So you kind of touched on it there, but you're very much a perennial globetrotter, and you see a lot of different angles related to perennial production and innovation, and that's really why I really was excited to have you on this podcast. So what are you seeing and hearing out there? I'm going to leave this wide open because, to be honest, I'm really just kind of selfishly interested in your answer.
Sure. Thank you. Well, one thing that in kind of my opening statement that I neglected to mention is there's a very important element to this whole piece of the puzzle, and that's clearly the consumer. And what I'm seeing happening in the perennial world is that breeders are hearing that the consumers are looking for plants that do come back in the landscape, that give them a lot of options in their various reasons, but are easy to grow and that basically behave like annuals. That's sort of in all the consumer surveys that we've seen and we've conducted. They say, well, I want this plant that's going to come back every year, but I don't want it to flower for 3 or 4 weeks. I want it to flower all season long, and we're really getting closer and closer to that. We've got a lot of really amazing perennial products that start to look more like annuals, and then I think in addition to that, growers are really learning that they're able to schedule perennials, particularly the new varieties that breeders are bringing to market, so that they can fill those voids in their offerings. And particularly when we look at, during the summer, a lot of times when I'm doing my garden center visits, I don't see a lot of color on the perennial tables because either it's leftover material that has just sort of hung on from spring and they've been cut back and people are trying to sell them, just on a tag and a promise, or the growers don't really know what they can schedule, how they can schedule it for that period. And, we're very excited about the opportunities that new varieties are presenting themselves in that area.
Well, and when you talk about needing the fresh items at the different seasons, I think that for years when I talk to Garden Center, they've mentioned, boy, we're not really seeing the traffic in the middle of the summer like we'd like to, and part of that was just like you said, it was the leftovers were out on the table, and so I think that having new breeding, new products being introduced to hit these different seasons and the production regimes behind it is going to be really critical to offering that fresh product in different seasons that is going to get the consumers coming back in over and over.
Absolutely.
So, part of this is the new breeding and the new products coming to market. So, what about some of your favorite new products coming to market? Why are you excited? Why should growers be excited? And what should the retailers expect?
Well, I think, there's a lot of really cool new stuff coming down the pipeline. And as perennial product development people, perennial breeders and suppliers into the market, we've sort of taken a new look and maybe even a fresh look at what truly is a perennial, because if you go into the deep south, many of the things that those of us here in Chicagoland or in the North U.S. would only consider on the annual table. I was just in Florida last week, and they're selling pentas and lantanas as perennials. So, we're doing a lot of breeding work in sort of some of these crossover perennial products that might be perennial in the South, things like some of the tender salvias. The salvia category, I think, is really wide open. We're so used to things like Salvia nemorosa and pratensis in the north, and those are sort of the mainstays of the hardy salvia world. But there's a lot of very beautiful salvia that give extended flowering and color all season. They're hummingbird magnets, they're pollinator magnets. Chicago Botanic Gardens is just completing a 3-year study on tender salvias and how well they work in northern landscapes. I'm super excited to see that work come out. So that's an area that I think is really exciting for us. And a really cool product that we've been in development for about 5 or 6 years is a summer flowering iris. Now, this isn't the traditional Iris sempervirens that we think of, zone 4. It's flowering in March, April in the south and April, May in the north. This is one that will start blooming in May, June and go all the way until September. So it gives the look of an iris. It won't be hardy, let's say, in Chicagoland. It's really a zone 6 perennial, but for a lot of the country, it's going to overwinter and more importantly, provide a look of an iris in a time of year when people aren't used to seeing that.
So are these long bloom windows, 90 days plus? Is this a focus of Darwin's introduction and breeding?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back into that. We want perennials that bloom like annuals. So things like leucanthemum, for instance, it's such a common perennial, and people have used them for decades and decades as mainstays in the landscape. But typically, they're flowering for a 4-week window in the spring. If they're cut back and the season goes long enough, they might get another flush, late summer, something like that. But we're able, through our breeding resources, to start to develop leucanthemum that are more ever blooming. So they have multiple generations of buds and blooms on the plant at one time. And we're seeing now where we can get, 10, even 12 weeks of flowering on a leucanthemum that, we never had that in the past.
That's awesome. And when you do, you're right. When you listen to consumer focus groups and they talk about perennials, they really, they don't want that one shot in the middle of summer. They're looking for a much longer period of garden performance. And I suspect that landscapers are looking for the same attributes. I mean, fewer times you have to get into that bed, the better.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, landscapers are the ultimate tried and true because that's the nature of their business. And so they're planting the varieties that they planted, 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And we're really taking on the responsibility of educating the designers, the landscape architects, and the landscapers that, hey, there's a lot of new things that you can put into these landscapes that you're servicing, cut down your service windows, give your customers more bloom time and that kind of thing. So that's another exciting element that we're involved in these days.
Cool. Well, I definitely wanted to hit on some of the trends that you're seeing and some of the things that you're seeing out in the market right now. But let's switch gears and really get down to our main topic, which is perennial problem children. So crops that do represent challenges in production and challenges that you guys are working so hard to overcome. So can you run through some of the most challenging crops for growers and I guess most importantly why they're challenging?
Sure. Yeah, I put together kind of a short list, and one of the beautiful things about the perennial world is it's extremely diverse, and I think that is what is attracting people to perennials. On the other hand, it's also part of the reason why people sort of take a step back and say, no, I'm going to maybe stay out of the perennial game because there's so much to learn and so much diversity that I just don't have enough hours in the day. So I'll kind of go through some of the items on my list and bring up maybe what some of the tripping points that growers can have, and hopefully this will help some of the people who are listening to the podcast today as they're looking at their programs and so on. And I think the first one that I wanted to mention is one that actually new breeding has helped, but it's also created some challenges for growers, and that's the category of Achillea. So Achillea is one of those mainstays in the perennial garden. It's been considered kind of an old-fashioned plant. It can be used as a cut flower. It's very persistent in the landscape, in some cases even considered a bit invasive, but it's certainly a long-blooming, very nice perennial. However, one of the things I've noticed as I've visited growers around the country is that because of the new breeding, people are still applying some of the old techniques where in the past, Achillea needed to be planted in the late summer, early fall to give the plants enough time to bulk up, and then provide enough flowers in the spring to be attractive at retail. However, with new genetics out on the marketplace, what I see happening is growers are still following their old schedules, but they're ending up with just way too much plant in the container by the time they get to spring and by the time they get to the flowering season. And consequently, the things are bursting at the seams. They're impossible to water at retail, and it's really not a good product going out to the consumer. So we've taken the approach with all of our new Achillea, like Achillea New Vintage, or we've got a new series called Millie Rock, which is very compact, that the growers should be transplanting a 72 cell liner, maybe even a little larger liner in the spring, because they're coming into bloom and ready for market in 6 to 10 weeks, depending on average day temperatures. So they don't have to grow them for that, 3 or 4 month cycle. They can go ahead and plant them in the spring, sell them in the spring, and get that turnover. So it really reduces their overwintering exposure, but more importantly, they get a lot nicer plant ultimately at retail. So the second product is an early spring item, and it's it's still something that may be a little unfamiliar to people. We've had it on the market for about 5 years now, and it's an alyssum, and it's a spring flowering yellow colored alyssum. So this is a very hardy plant, about zone 4 hardy. The variety name is called Golden Spring, and it's a species called Wolfenianum. So this is an alpine species of alyssum, really beautiful, kind of small silvery green foliage. And there's a few tricks on this one that I want to let the listeners know about. Number one, all these alyssum are in the Brassica family, so these are kind of related to broccoli and Brussels sprouts and all those kind of things. So as we start getting into the flowering window, which is going to traditionally be February, March, in April in the north, they really get hungry. And I've seen crops of Alyssum Golden Spring where the plants look beautiful, but then the center foliage on this container is starting to turn yellow. So with what we recommend to growers is at the time you start seeing buds swelling on the plant, go in and apply at least a 200 part per million nitrogen liquid feed. Most growers in perennials are using some sort of a controlled release fertilizer. It may either be running out by the time they get to spring, or it's just that the plants are so active that they can't keep up in terms of their nitrogen uptake. They end up going into nitrogen debt, sacrificing those older leaves, and consequently it's just not as attractive of a plant at retail as it could be. So we again like to have growers kind of put that on their schedule, even if they have to go out with a portable injector or something like that. Get that feed on just as they're coming into bud, and they're going to end up with a much nicer plant to take to retail. The other kind of tip on that Alyssum Golden Spring is for the growers who are doing their own self-prop is to make sure that they're sticking the cutting deep enough so that there's only about 2 nodes or so above the soil line, and then making sure that they have actively growing side shoots when they pinch. We've seen some cases where if the cuttings were a little bit long and the growers pinch those cuttings very high so that they're leaving 5-6 nodes below, they end up having blind shoots, and consequently they're not getting branching on those rooted cuttings. We've tried to correct that by having the correct cutting size coming out of the production farms, but occasionally if a cutting comes in a little bit too long and the grower doesn't stick it deep enough, they can end up with a blind shoot. So we hate to see that, and I think it's pretty easily overcome. Another product that has been extremely exciting in the marketplace is the Armeria Dremeria series, and this is kind of a new animal because it's hybrid breeding coming out of Australia. Normally, a typical Armeria is going to be either grown from seed, so that propagation is pretty straightforward. And there are some other Armerias, kind of the cutting raised sea thrifts, which are fairly easy to propagate. The Dremeria are also easy to propagate. However, they tend to need a higher amount of rooting hormone than most perennial plants. So on most perennial plants like a Coreopsis or a Salvia, we're going to say between 500 and 1,000 parts per million basal dip of IBA. In the case of the Dremeria, we found that we really need to go up to about 2,500 parts per million IBA to get consistent and uniform rooting. And when we do that, things are like little soldiers. When we don't, they get really slow and uneven in terms of their rooting, and that's created some headaches for propagators, and it's created some headaches for growers. So we really want to encourage people to use those higher rates, and they'll be a lot more effective. The next product that comes to mind, and we get questions on this one every year since we've introduced it, is the interspecific Digiplexus type digitalis. Our series is called Foxlight, And in the Foxlight series, there's 3 colors. One of the challenges that growers have had is that depending on the time of year that they want to finish them and depending on their growing cycle, they can run into some trouble getting these things into flower. So we've actually created kind of an entire PDF of the flowering process for the Digitalis Foxlight, and essentially the real trick there is for early flowering. So the growers who want to force these things into bloom for, let's say, an April 1 or an Easter or even a Mother's Day window, it can certainly be done. But in those cases, the Foxlight Digitalis need to be vernalized. That's the only way you're really going to force them for early spring. So we recommend between 800 and 1,000 hours below 50 degrees Fahrenheit to make sure that we're getting that full vernalization. Then they can be forced under long days, at least 14-hour day length, and come into bloom about 12 weeks after forcing. So we've done that reliably. We've done it multiple years now for instance, California spring trials. So we know that system works. So then one of the things we've discovered in sort of with some of the failures that, let's say, our customers have had is that there's a window of time from about early January until about the 1st of March when growers will plant a non-vernalized young plant. And then they'll end up with the plant going into almost a biennial mode. So then they don't see flowering in let's say, late May, early June like they would expect, but they end up seeing flowering in August or maybe not even at all that year. So we actually don't recommend any young plants be planted in that sort of darkest, coldest time of the year because the plant gets confused, it sort of starts to shut down, goes into a biennial mode, and then it's really hard to kick it out. So we kind of recommend that either if people are planting a vernalized plug, they can plant it then, but a fresh non-vernalized, they should plant no later than about week 50, and then don't plant again in a non-vernalized plug until you get to about week 10. Those are probably 2 of the main issues. The other one on the Foxlight Digitalis is they are sensitive to low calcium. So I've seen cases where we've got fairly mature plants just getting into bud, and we start seeing the signs of upper leaf curl and bud abortion from low calcium. So that's a time when you could go in and do a calcium nitrate spray of a couple hundred parts per million, and also watch the watering, because if they're overwatered and waterlogged, that really limits the calcium uptake. A couple other things that I wanted to go through variety-wise. One of our most popular products at Darwin Perennials is Echinacea sombrero, and we've got a very great color range in the sombreros. It's a wonderful plant at retail. Sell-through has been very high, but there's a few tricks that I think can help growers be more successful. First of all, we typically recommend that growers wait and plant their Echinacea in the spring. Historically, all of these really colorful Echinacea grown from TC needed to be planted in the summer so they could bulk up and have multiple flower shoots for sale at retail in the spring and summer the next year. However, there was always a lot of winter loss. So growers might end up with a 10, 15, 20% loss over winter. Clearly that increases their cost. And then just by nature of the fact that they're growing those things for so many months, they've got that additional cost invested as well. So we've been recommending with sombreros that they be planted in the spring. And one thing with sombrero Echinacea, if they're planted even under long days, they will bulk up. But one of the challenges that growers can have sometimes in the spring is if they're planting their sombreros into, let's say, a hoop house with minimal heat or cold soil temperatures, they don't get uniform takeoff with the plant. So coupled with that recommendation of planting in the spring, we also recommend that the grower is able to maintain around a 60-degree Fahrenheit soil temperature for the first 3 weeks or so that the plants really become well established. And what that does is it encourages rapid root development, and it also encourages good rapid lateral shoot development so that they get this nice full bushy plant. Otherwise, we've seen problems where, depending on the year, some years in February and March, we get a lot of sunlight in the north and the greenhouses warm up. So the average soil temperature is good, and the grower has a pretty successful crop. And then the next year, it's a cold, dark January, February, March. Average soil temperatures are low, and then they end up having losses and inconsistencies. So that can really end up being a problem on the echinacea. And one more thing that I wanted to mention on the sombrero, and I think this is really important, more and more growers are finding that for fall, diversity is good. So they're adding perennials into their fall program, and sombreros are an ideal product for that because, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, sombreros will bulk up under long days. A lot of these hybrid echinaceas, when they're grown under long days, they tend to send up just one flowering shoot and not be very attractive that first summer. So we're seeing growers now planting sombrero echinacea in, let's say, late May through the month of June, even up as late as early July, and then they're selling them in the market mid-August, really on through till beginning of October. So that works out really well. The next product I wanted to touch on is Heliopsis sunstruck. So Heliopsis helianthoides is the genus and species, and this is one that in fact, I visited a grower this summer that says, boy, we love this plant, but we just can't do it. It just fails us constantly. And I asked a little bit more, tried to get some detail on how they were managing it, and they were actually following our guidelines from the standpoint of bringing young plants in late winter, transplanting them into their gallon containers, and then putting them in their growing houses and so on. But one thing they missed in our recommendations is that this is a long day obligate perennial, and long day obligate to the standpoint that under short days it goes completely dormant. I mean, the leaves fall off and you think the plant has died. So when they're bringing young plants in and, let's say, transplanting those in late January or early February to try to hit let's say a mid-April market, they've got to grow those young plants and their finished containers under long days. This will be a problem. It's the same way for the growers who, let's say, want to grow this as an overwintered plant. The plants need to be put in their finished containers early enough in the summer so that they have a chance to bulk up, build a nice root system, and then they're going to go to sleep starting in October after the days get short. So if a grower brings in their young plants, let's say in early September, mid-September, that plant won't have enough time to get established before it goes dormant, and there'll be a lot of losses in the process. So from a standpoint of just light requirements, long day requirements, that's super important on the Heliopsis. The other one that we've seen with the Heliopsis is they can be sensitive to some PGRs and more importantly, sensitive to some fungicides. So we like to have growers be careful when they're using fungicides like Heritage, for instance. We've had burn and losses using Heritage. So I would say steer clear of that one when you're looking at your fungicide use on Heliopsis. Talking about lavender for a minute, that's probably the fastest growing perennial category for some of the growers, particularly on the West Coast. Lavender is probably their number one SKU for many people. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges growers can have with lavender in terms of growing and so on, and how to overcome that. Lavender, of course, is a plant that's typically pretty high in essential oils, and that's one of the reasons why it's so fragrant and the foliage smells so good. But it also creates a challenge in propagation. So I like to use the term that lavenders are kind of hydrophobic in propagation. They don't like a whole lot of water. And what I see, some of the more successful growers are either using fog systems where they're not even misting their lavender, they're just keeping the humidity high enough to keep the plants from drying out, or they're using something like a tent system over the plants so that, again, they're not pumping a lot of water into propagation and managing it that way. The stems on lavender cuttings typically are quite tender and soft. And if the sticking crew is not careful, they can end up breaking that stem. And oftentimes when I'm looking at lavender crops in propagation that are not doing well, I can go through and find the ones that were broken off just by being a little bit too rough. So pre-dibbling is really important on lavender, and just being careful about the sticking and so on. The other thing that we've seen, and I've seen this in particular on English lavender, is that some of the varieties, and we see this with our lavender super blue, which can be in the north especially, and even through the middle part of the country, flowered all summer long and into fall, that they don't like to go through a cold and a vernalization period. The newer lavenders on the market don't require vernalization to flower, particularly the English lavenders. And when they do go through a cold period, they have a tendency to go into a almost dormant phase. So they become very silver, the internodes become really stacked, and they essentially shut down. And when they do that, it takes them a long time to come into flower. So for a grower who wants to bring their English lavenders into bloom in March or April, I recommend that they keep them actively growing. So maintain average day temperatures above 55, between 55 and 60 degrees. That will keep the plants moving along. They're going to flower because they don't require vernalization to flower. And more importantly, you avoid that dormancy, which can delay flowering by 2 months even. That it really is a problem if people aren't paying attention to that when they're bringing their lavender into flower. The last product that I wanted to talk about, and this it tends to be more of an issue in propagation, but I've seen it affecting some of the Finnish growers as well, is Perovskia, the Russian sage. And this is a plant that has kind of an interesting habit when it's being propagated, and that is it will make a very aggressive callus. It'll make actually quite a large callus. Some growers have confused that with an agrobacterium gall, but most of the time it's not agrobacterium, although it can be. But so I don't want to suggest that it can never be this, but more often than not, I see these really extensive callus formations on Perovskia, and that's directly related to excess moisture in the propagation media. So if you're propagating your own Perovskia, I recommend that use mist cycles that are, kind of frequent light misting so that you're not overwetting that media, and then get the plants out of the propagation environment as soon as you're starting to see some reasonable callus tissue on the base, but before it gets excessive. The other thing is, and again, this goes for the people doing their own propagation, start feeding early. I recommend this on most perennials, that generally by day 7 you can start adding feed to the irrigation water, and the plants are calloused enough at that point they can start taking up nutrients. For things like Salvia amorosa, it's super critical to start feeding early. Those plants will shut down if they're not fertilized early in the cycle. So I recommend that. And it would go the same way as for the young plants you receive. So if you're receiving any perennials, say in a 72 cell from your propagator, make sure that you're feeding that product in the 72 cell while you're waiting to transplant, or make sure that immediately after transplant there's good feed in the media so that they can really jump off to a good start. So I think those are some of the highlights, I guess, Bill, that I wanted to present today and hopefully be helpful to the listeners.
Wow, that is a ton of really, really good information. You're like the guidance counselor for perennial problem children. I mean, you covered, some of the feeding necessities, the timing, what to watch for, even chemicals not to use. And I love that you covered some like true retail stars already, like the Foxlight, the Sombrero, obviously lavenders, huge retail products, but also some of the up and comers like the Drumeria and the Sunstruck. So really appreciate all of that fantastic information. So if you had to boil some of these challenges down to maybe, I don't know, like your top 3 or 4 tips for perennial growers, what would those tips be?
Well, I think if I were to boil down to the kind of the top three tips, I really think that you know learn your varieties. I think that's very important, and oftentimes that is something that is overlooked. People tend to stay in their lane and stay in their comfort zone, but there's so much good stuff out there that it's worth learning. That can save growers time. It can save them losses. It can increase the shelf life and retailability, but it's going to take some work. Bring in trial material, but really learn your varieties so that you can consistently be successful. A trend that I'm seeing at large growers around the country is they are taking more control over their perennial production. And what I mean by that is, traditionally perennials are either grown in sort of frost-free or maybe not even frost-free hoop houses in the north where they're under some cover. In the south, they have a tendency to be grown right outdoors. And in either case, the grower is at the mercy of what's happening. Is this an early season? Is it a late season? And consequently, they can end up with gaps at retail. So more and more growers are managing the young plant longer into the cycle. And by that I mean instead of transplanting a 100 cell liner or a 72 cell liner, which is a pretty small plant, they're either doing their own bump up. So if the grower's not doing their own propagation, they're bumping up into a 32 cell or a 21 cell, or they're propagating directly into a larger cell. And then they're growing that in a controlled environment. Now, I realize that may appear to be adding some cost, but if you think about it, let's say if I'm growing my perennial crop in a 21 cell, that tray is about 15 plants per square foot or so. When I'm growing them out of my nursery, even pot tight, that's 4 plants per square foot, or if it's spaced, it's about 1 plant per square foot. So, managing it at that 15 plants per square foot level allows the grower to be in a lot more control of temperature regimes, lighting regimes, pest and disease control, all those kind of things. And then the beauty is you take that 21 cell as the weather starts getting better, pop it up into a gallon container, and these growers are finishing in 4, 5, 6 weeks a perennial that might have in the past taken 10 or 12 weeks or maybe even several months if they were doing fall planting. So I see that as a major trend. It allows for actually, believe it or not, I think less labor because they're not covering and uncovering the perennials out in the field. They can plant these things on planting lines, and the planting lines now are getting so quick and efficient that they're able to do it actually cheaper, even though they're adding that extra step into the mix. So I think those are probably a couple of things that I think really are new innovations into the market and will help people be a lot more successful in their perennial production when it's all said and done.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that, you referenced earlier the diversity and the tremendous diversity in perennials. So yeah, definitely learning these new varieties, realizing that there's new genetics coming to market that are there to solve problems. And then yeah, there's more control or longer control. And I like how you mentioned that that's really, comes down to labor savings and efficiency. So obviously that's on everybody's mind these days. So we do need to wrap this up. You've given us so much great information. I feel like we just got started, but If you were to break out your crystal ball and look into the future, do you see that this demand and this expanding perennial market continuing? Do you see the product mix changing? What do you think, with your perspective and industry history, looking forward, what do you think the perennial market's going to look like in the next 5 years?
Well, I see more of the retail shelf space being utilized by perennials, and for a variety of reasons. We talked about quite a few of those, longer flowering time, really more able to handle environmental changes. In other words, if I have perennials that I'm using for decorating in the fall and put them on my patio, they're going to take a frost, where some of the annuals that are fall colors like coleus and zinnias and things like that, they're beautiful, but man, the first cold wind and they're done. So I see that happening. The issue, I would say, and one of the biggest draws right now in the perennial plant category, is the fact that they are so pollinator friendly, and there is a great and thankfully great sensitivity in the part of the consumer to the needs of maintaining a healthy pollinator population. And that's not just bees, it's monarch butterflies, it's hummingbirds. So when we look at the perennial plants that we have available to us now, they're all exceptional pollinators. And I think that's going to drive a lot of perennial sales. And then just the diversity and the beauty of perennials. And I grew up on the annual side of the business probably more than the perennial side, just because there just wasn't that much going on, when I was in the garden center business back in the 1980s and 90s. But what I see now in perennials and the excitement in the different species that breeders are bringing to market, and the just the innovations coming in perennials, I see it increasing interest, increasing usability, increasing all the great things that perennials can bring to the consumer.
It's funny you mentioned pollinators. One of the things I always think about when I look forward to spring trials each year is the hummingbirds that are all over the foxlight digitalis, and the bees that are always on that alyssum and the iberis in the Darwin perennials area. I mean, it's like never fails. Those hummingbirds come back every year to check out the digitalis. So,
and the cool thing is we see that even here in Illinois, the salvias and the digitalis are attracting the hummingbirds, and in the hummingbird moss and so on. And I always think of California as being the hummingbird place where I'm used to seeing them, but boy, they're all over here as well.
I think we could do a whole episode on perennial pollinators. It's such a huge trend at retail, and something that our industry really needs to capitalize on. It's like we have this amazing, built-in marketing angle where we're actually doing a lot of good for the environment. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So, I really appreciate all your time, Karl. Is there anything that you want to bring up before we go? And also, if our listeners have any questions for you, or questions about some of these problem children perennials, what's the best way to get in touch? So if you have any final thoughts, and then the best way to get in touch with you.
Sure. Well, maybe my parting thoughts would be this, that I'd encourage our listeners, growers, retailers, to continue to educate yourself and your staff on these latest growing techniques, on the latest varieties. Come to events like Darwin Perennial Day. This year in 2019, it will be June 19th, so that's fairly easy, 6/19/19. We always have great speakers. We've got lots of perennial genetics, not just Darwin perennials. You can see perennial varieties from lots of different producers like Walter's Gardens and Doom and Orange and Florensis, etc. So there's lots to see there. And then visit trial sites. University of Georgia has a lot of perennials in their trials, Colorado State, Dallas Arboretum, Penn State. So there's lots of places to see perennials. So I think just continuing to educate yourself. In terms of my contact information, I probably won't spell out my name here, but you'll have it somewhere on a website, Batschke at darwinperennials.com. You can send me an email if you have questions. If I don't have the answer, we've got lots of resources within our group. And then I'd encourage any listeners who are interested to go to darwinperennials.com. We've got cultural information on all the Darwin perennial varieties there, propagation, finishing, growing. We've got culture guides. We've got scheduling tools. So there's just a lot there, and we're kind of coming into that time of year for people who are perennial growers where they're not quite as busy as they are at other times. So it's a good time to refresh and recharge your knowledge base on perennials right now.
Thanks again, Karl. And to our STEM listeners, the Darwin team really is loaded with knowledgeable perennials experts who can help you deal with these misbehaviors that we've talked about, and also to help you fill your greenhouse with the top, latest new genetics and best performers. So be sure to check out the show notes for all of the resources that I mentioned and that Karl talked about, and all of the information to revolutionize your perennial production.